You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 199 of the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan. My name's Kevin O'Shea, and I am the host of this weekly podcast about all things Japan. And this week we've got another fantastic episode for you guys. Oh, that's right. We're going to be talking about Japanese whiskey with none other than Brian Ashcraft. And Brian Ashcraft is a very well-known Japan-based writer. He writes for Kotaku, Japan Times, lots of different places. He's written a lot of books about Japanese culture, and he also wrote a book about Japanese whiskey, which is going to be really awesome to learn about. Now, I got to admit, I'm not a big whiskey drinker, but I have friends who are, and I spent enough years in Japan to know that, whiskey is a very important alcohol in Japan. Japanese businessmen, Japanese men in general tend to really enjoy, imbibing in whiskey. So we learned quite a lot today in this episode about Japanese whiskey, some of the history of it when it was first produced in Japan. And it was really fantastic to get Brian on the show for the first time. And I know that after our first interview, we'll definitely have him on again. So, guys, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And before we get into that interview portion of the podcast, I just want to let you know that it would be really awesome when you're listening. If you listen to the Just Japan podcast on iTunes, if you went over to iTunes and left a rating and a review, if you're using an iOS device like an iPad or an iPhone, you can just scroll down to the bottom of the podcast area and you can type it all in very easily. That would definitely help us. We were on hiatus for a couple of years. We haven't really had reviews in a long time, so it'd be really great if we could get some new reviews from you awesome folks. Of course, the home of the Just Japan podcast is over at justjapanstuff.com. That's where the show notes will be. All the links we talk about today will be all there. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Mad4Maple. I'm really active there. So guys, hey, it's episode 199. Whoa, we're almost at 200, and that's going to be an awesome one. So let's get going, and let's listen to my interview with Brian Ashcraft about Japanese whiskey. Okay, Just Japan podcast listeners, we're back with another fantastic episode, and this one we're going to be talking all about Japanese whiskey and some other things. This week's guest is not only a writer for Kotaku, but the Japan Times. He has his own book all about Japanese whiskey, which is called Japanese Whiskey, the Ultimate Guide to the World's Most Desirable Spirit with Tasting Notes from Japan's leading whiskey blogger. And he's also got an upcoming article for the Whiskey Advocate. This week, I'd like to introduce you guys and welcome Brian Ashcraft to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. So, one of the first things I always, ask someone who comes on the Just Japan podcast is to, of course, introduce themselves. And maybe could you tell us a little bit about, how you ended up in Japan and what you do in Japan?
Okay. So I arrived in Japan in 2001. And that's the same year I graduated from college.
Okay.
And I'd always been interested in Japan since I was maybe in grade school.
Okay.
There was a couple of kids who were foreign exchange students, and I remember maybe it was in second grade or third grade. The teacher then decided that all the kids in the class should learn about Japan. And that then culminated in us going out to eat at a Japanese restaurant. And it was a Japanese restaurant. I'm from Dallas, originally. It's called Little Tokyo.
Okay.
And I just had like a really, really kind of profound experience. Like when I had like miso soup, I just thought it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever had in my life.
Mm.
And so from that point, I'd always been really interested in Japan. When I was in college, I had an internship during the summer in Los Angeles in the movie business,
Okay.
and it was for a distribution company, and that company released like a Chungking Express in America for the first time, the Wong Kar-wai movie, but it also released Sonatine, the first Beat Takeshi movie,
Okay.
to be released in the United States. And my boss was really, really into Japanese movies and Japanese culture, Japanese art. I mean, he like was a huge fan of like, also sumo as well. And so he went to Japan one summer to try to buy the rights to some Gamera movies, the new Gamera movies with Steven Seagal's daughter in it.
Okay.
And and he wasn't able to get them, and he was trying to buy some Yakuza movies as well, and he wasn't able to get them, but he had a really great time in Japan. And so I kind of felt like, well, after I go to college, I'll kind of, maybe I should go to Japan and see what it was like. And I think like for anyone who grew up in the 80s, you grew up with like Nintendo and just like, and then there was a big movie influence for me as well. And so I just was really interested to go to Japan. And then it ended up turning into like, how many years is it now? 18 years or something like that.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it ended up being a lot longer than I expected, but that's how I got here. That's kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, but that's the backstory.
Yeah. And that happens to so many people you meet in Japan, you talk to. It's like, well, I came here for a year. That was how it worked for me. It's like I had a 2-year plan, and 10 years later I left. And desperately want to come back. But yeah, so okay, so I listed off a few things at the beginning of the podcast. You write for a lot of different websites and papers and different blogs and whatnot. But one thing, I mean, for me personally, where I first came across you was on Kotaku. So I'm curious, for those out there, I'm sure most people do know what this is, but for those out there who may not know, what is Kotaku and what do you do there? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about other writing that you do.
So Kotaku is it's I guess a video game site blog, and we write about, because the name is it's not a real Japanese word, but it's kind of based on Japanese. We cover Japanese pop culture and stuff like that as well. So there's kind of a wide range of stuff that I write about for them. And that was always kind of the idea, that when I originally was hired in 2005, that's kind of how I, during my interview for the job, kind of how I pitched myself. I said, well, there's game stuff as well, but I'd like to write about other stuff. And over the years, I've been very fortunate to kind of have the freedom to do that. So, for example, I don't know when this is going to go up, but yesterday, it might be the other day. I did an interview, or I did an interview. I published an interview that I'd done with Ryan Williams about the Detective Pikachu movie. So that's a very kind of, it's related to video games, and but I also did an article about visitors to Japan complaining about the slurping sounds that people make when eating their noodles.
I read that one today, actually. Yeah.
so it's within the same day. It's one is based on an interview that I did in person with the star of a new movie about Detective Pikachu, and then the other one is this kind of cultural piece about something that's happening in Japan. So they're very different stories, and for me that makes writing at Kotaku incredibly interesting. There's a whole kind of range of topics that can come across my screen, or desk, in a given day. So before that, before I started working at Kotaku, I for many years I was at Wired Magazine.
Oh, okay.
So that's where I kind of that was like my first paying writing job. And then before that, I was trying to become a paid writer, and so I was doing stuff for free online and stuff. But
Okay.
and then I did other magazines, stuff like that. And now, so it's now mostly Kotaku, the Japan Times, and then if any time that I can then squeeze in after that, then I fill that with usually books.
Okay, nice. Well, let's get into that. So, there's one thing that I know you know about, and definitely, I'm sure there's definitely some people out there who listen to this podcast who are interested in the topic. I know last week's guest, Kansai PJ, he's a big fan of whiskey, and he's kind of an aficionado. I've been to the Yamazaki distillery a few times with him over the years when I lived in the Kansai. So I'm curious,
Right.
like for a lot of people out there, when they think about whiskey, I think that probably the first things that pop in their mind would be Scotland or Ireland, or if you're thinking of single malts, you're definitely thinking Scotland. So I'm curious, for the uninitiated out there, what's the deal with Japanese whiskey? Is it good stuff, and how is it connected to kind of modern Japanese culture?
So I guess they haven't been making real whiskey in Japan yet for 100 years. They're coming up on I think we have about 5 or 6 years to go, and then we'll hit the 100-year mark of when real whiskey distillation began in Japan. But before that, it was the Americans who originally brought whiskey to Japan when Commodore Perry rolled up in the 1850s. They brought a bunch of presents to give to the emperor. They brought like an early camera, and then they had a miniature steam train, and they had like a telegraph lines that they could send messages through, and then they also brought casks of whiskey.
Okay.
And the emperor at that time was in Kyoto and did not like that basically on his watch that these foreigners, these Americans, were asserting themselves and trying to disrupt things. And he never got any of the gifts. I mean, as far as we know, none of the gifts never, as far as we know, never made it to him. And the Americans never really seemed to know that they weren't dealing with like the emperor, that they were dealing with the samurai and the officials there in Edo. So they had brought all these casks of whiskey as presents, and all the things that they'd brought. And we have early official accounts from the Americans of how these Japanese samurai responded to drinking whiskey. Apparently, they enjoyed it, and there's a very famous story about a large party that they had with it ended up with one samurai hugging Commodore Perry very tightly at the end of the evening.
Okay.
Saying that they had like kind of the same heart. So that's kind of where whiskey started. But after that, when whiskey came into Japan, it was largely for foreigners.
Okay.
Foreign expats, and they started making kind of fake whiskey for kind of people who might have been curious to what it was, but it wasn't really a major drink.
Okay.
And then in the 19 teens, a company in Osaka decided that it wanted to make real whiskey, and it sent one of its employees, a guy named Masataka Taketsuru, the guy who would go on to found Nikka, and they sent him to Scotland to learn about how whiskey was made. And he came back with that know-how, and he also got married, so he brought back his Scottish-born wife, who became a Japanese citizen. And around that time, there was a that original company that sent him there went belly up, or not belly up. They just decided not to. That company was around later until the 50s and 60s, but that company then decided it didn't want to make real whiskey, and Taketsuter then hooked up with Tori, Shinjiro Tori, the guy who founded the company that became Suntory.
Okay.
And hired him to be the first distillery manager at Yamazaki.
Okay.
So if you've been to Yamazaki,
yeah, I have. Yeah.
So something that's one thing that always gives me kind of a big kick about going to Yamazaki is that there is a photo of Taketsuru-san in the museum there.
Okay.
And it's with him holding the first bottle of Suntory whiskey to come off, the bottling line. And it's this photo with him and all the other distillery workers. And the caption says something like, distillery workers pose in like a commemorative photo with the first bottle of Suntory whiskey. And it does not say Taketsuru. It does not say his name on it, which is kind of amusing. That if you ask some people at Suntory Yamazaki about Taketsuru-san, they will happily talk about it and explain that history. But there seemed to be for a long time a distancing of him.
Okay.
And that even. You probably know this. Like corporate Japan is not usually playing games. I mean, when their rivalries are pretty fierce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the whiskey world is no exception to that. Especially the guy that brought back this kind of know-how from Scotland, and then he went off to found a rival company. That's kind of like
okay.
Do you see what I'm saying? That's kind of
yeah.
For corporate Japan, that's kind of
you even see that you see that on a small scale in Japan. I think of even like when I worked there in the education sector, and when you would have someone who would kind of have a falling out with upper management or an owner. I mean, that person was became persona non grata. I mean, they were just wiped from the history and memory.
Right, and so I always wonder if, for example, if it's because he's in that photo holding the first bottle of Suntory whiskey that they can't erase him. He's so integral to that history. The other thing that's kind of amusing is that if you kind of go up the hill, like kind of off to the side, it's close to the distillery, right next to it, but close within the kind of the vicinity. There's a house that Asahi Beer owns. Asahi Beer owns Nikka.
Okay.
And so the guy who used to live in that house had paid a lot of money to set up the Nikka, the distillery, the Yoichi distillery.
Okay.
So there's this property that's owned now by Asahi that's right next to Suntory because their corporate histories are so kind of intermingled and intertwined that the guy who helped pay Taketsuru's like meal ticket out of Suntory is like used to live right up the hill. So
wow,
it's almost
like they're ribbing them by buying that property, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they are, but it's just that period of time is just really interesting. And so because I mean the original history of whiskey in Japan is American, but Taketsuru-san went to Scotland and was very interested in Scotch whiskey, and ever since then that's kind of pulled a Japanese whiskey closer to Scotch.
Okay.
So if you were to depending on who you ask, if you were to ask, for example, the chief blender at Nikka, he would probably tell you that if you had a tray of samples of Scotch, and in that you'd mixed in like in Japanese whiskey, probably in that case Nikka whiskey, that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's what he would say.
Okay.
I think Suntory has always kind of taken a slightly different approach, and has always, for decades, has always thought of itself as, even from its original inception, has always thought of itself as making Japanese whiskey.
Okay.
The first bottles that rolled out of the off the bottling line were white label. The second bottles that rolled off, the second release that they did was red. So then you have white and red. You have these immediately. You have these kind of iconic Japanese colors. And they've really, I mean, even during the 1960s, they were kind of promoting their whiskey as Japanese whiskey, even in America. So that's why it's closer to Scotch, but it's still different. I wouldn't say that it's Japanese. I mean, I think that's like incorrect to just call it a type of Scotch or close to Scotch. It's kind of its own thing. It does follow the Scotch tradition pretty closely. Scotch whiskey is typically distilled twice. Irish whiskey is typically, I mean, this is an oversimplification. Is typically distilled 3 times. But I think flavor wise, a lot of the flavors that I get in Japanese whiskey remind me of stuff that you'll get in like a dashi, especially like kind of an udon dashi with like kitsune. There's kind of a wonderful sweetness, and it's very, very smooth and very easy, and very palatable. So I think that's something that Japanese whiskey does very well. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, to this, but that's something I think it does very, very well. But yeah, I mean, just with regards to anything, I mean, you know this very well. I mean, if you take something and then you give it to a different country and then they start doing it, naturally it's going to become, I mean, the people in that country are going to just take their you probably see this in China, you've seen this in Japan. It changes, and the same thing happened to whiskey.
I mean, and this will kind of sound like a bit of a barbarian example, but I mean, if you simply look at McDonald's, I mean, the iconic American fast food restaurant, when you go to McDonald's here in Beijing or in Japan, I mean, in some ways they're the same, but in other ways they're distinctly different with the menu items. Right. Like, again, sort of a barbaric example. But I mean, so I want to talk for a moment. Like, we don't have a whole lot of time tonight to chat. So I'm curious about the book you wrote. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and a little bit about the process of putting it together?
So it's, with any of the, I've done books about whiskey and Japanese tattoos. And, I did a book about cosplay, and then I did a book about like schoolgirl culture, and I did a book about arcades. So they're all really different. And they recently they take about 3 years to do. Okay. And so what I end up doing is then staggering them with another book as I'm finishing up, then doing the next one. So I pitched it around the same time that I was doing the tattoo book, and then the tattoo book as I was finishing, and then I started doing the whiskey book. And it basically is find every single thing you can find about Japanese whiskey, interview as many people as you can, go everywhere. And so it was a really involved process. One thing that we really wanted to do, I was fortunate to have 2 terrific collaborators on this book, is that we wanted to go as deep as possible. So, we try to find people that had never been interviewed before, instead of like something that people often do when they're writing, a book or, an article or whatever, is they'll kind of just call up the main PR office at whatever company, and then whatever is kind of put before them, they interview that person, and then they have the material for their article, and then they go write their article. One thing that we found that we wanted to do was really push beyond that. So, we would find, we found a woman who grew up behind the Yamazaki distillery during the war. Okay. So when you go to the Yamazaki distillery, at the very end of the tour, after you go through the maturation, the maturation cellar, you come out at a little pond.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do.
So that pond is completely man-made, and didn't I mean,
Okay.
they're piping in the water. Originally, there was a pond back there,
Okay.
and there was a house back there, and we found the woman who grew up in that house.
Oh wow.
And we talked to her about, like, she was living in Osaka City. Obviously, Osaka City starts being bombed flat, firebombed.
Yeah.
So her parents were like, okay, we're moving out. We're going to move out to the countryside. They buy this plot of land. They build a house on it, and right in front of them is the Yamazaki distillery. And so every morning when she'd walk out of her house and look at the view in front of her, there was a lake, or like a little pond, and a pond where the maturation cellar would be now.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the distillery. And so just hearing her talk about it, like talking about, like, her father built this house, and then the bombers started, like, flying in. They could see them flying into Osaka City. And then they start getting worried because the Yamazaki distillery was a wartime factory.
Oh, okay.
So then they're kind of, like, worried of, like, did we just pick the worst place to move to?
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff is, when people tend to write, about Japanese whiskey, you don't often hear that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We found this one guy who was, like, got a job at Nika when he was, like, 13 or 14 during the war, like a kid. He was just like a little kid, and because all the men were out fighting, so the people that were making whiskey during the war were children, literally children.
Wow.
And women.
Wow.
And that was and if you look at, like, the annual staff photo from during the war, it's a bunch of, like, little kids, and women, and that's who was making the whiskey. And so that kind of stuff was, like, we wanted to bring out stories like that. We wanted to talk to all the people who make all the whiskey, and then talk about why it was unique and what was Japanese about it, but really kind of get in the weeds. And so finding those people was a lot of times it was luck, just kind of literally bumping into these people. A lot of times it was, kind of like, just, like, kind of good old fashioned kind of gumshoe reporting stuff. But yeah, that was really the process. It was really, really involved, I'll be honest. And then added on that, you have to drink all this whiskey, like, that's the other thing, is, like, you're doing all this reporting, and then you have to drink, a fair amount of whiskey. And then you have to, the man who wrote the foreword for the book, his name is Lou Bryson, and he wrote this really great book called Tasting Whiskey. And I think it's one of the best books ever written about whiskey. And if you're just wanting to get into whiskey and, like, kind of really kind of understand the flavors in it, I highly recommend his book.
Okay.
But he talks about, like, pushing on through, like, a wall. And you have to, like, push through a wall, because when you start, you're dealing with alcohol that's coming in at, like, 40. It's coming in hot. It's coming at 40, at least 40%.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of alcohol, and so you have to learn how to ignore that to get to the different flavors and aromas in it, which is it honestly involves drinking a lot of whiskey, but
not a bad part of the job,
Not a bad part, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's not just drinking it for pleasure. It's really kind of like
to learn, to understand.
Right. It's not just like, oh, like, like, I get a drink tonight. It's not that at all. It's totally different. So that was just, it was, really, really interesting, and, really, enjoyable process. And, it's great. I'd written about, drinks before, but it was really great to spend, like, several years, like, really, really deep in it, and exploring Japanese whiskey.
That sounds very cool. I know that we have a limited time together, so this evening, so I don't want to keep you too long. So I mean, I could go on for hours listening to this. It's really fascinating. This is a great reason to get you on again to talk about some of the other things you're doing. But you know, it's almost that time. So for
Mhm.
people out there who are listening, who know of you, who know who you are, or maybe not, where can they
Mhm.
find your work out there on the internet, out there on the social media landscape?
Um, I mean, Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I enjoy the Twitter. Yeah.
As do I. As do I.
Yeah. So, yeah, Brian underscore Ashcraft. So at Brian underscore Ashcraft. Kotaku every day, pretty much every day. And then yeah, I'm working on a new book now, and that hopefully will be out next spring. That's what we're kind of looking at now. So finishing that up and then on to the next book. So it's
Fantastic.
so,
Fantastic. And guys, and I'm going to put in the show notes for all of you guys out there listening, all these links. I'm going to put links to his book, books. I'll put several in there, and where you can find his writing, Kotaku, all those places. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit down with the folks out there of the Just Japan podcast universe.
oh, it's my pleasure. I'd love to come back and chat some more. Had a great time.
We'd love to have you.
Please hang up and try again.
So I want to thank Brian for taking the time to stop by the Just Japan podcast. He's a busy guy. He's got a very tight schedule. We were able to squeeze in 30 minutes with him, which was really awesome. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, hopefully in the future, we can get some more time to hang out with Brian. And that was really great. Go to the show notes at justjapanstuff.com for episode number 199. Look at the show notes and check out all the links of all the things we talked about. Go buy his book about Japanese whiskey and check out the other books he's written. Really cool stuff. Now, guys, before we go for this week, I want to mention one thing. Okay, so any of you guys out there listening who are fans of Japan, who have a Japan-related business, website, travel thing, maybe you've got some kind of geek culture business that's related to Japan, if the Just Japan podcast is now looking for advertisers. That's right. I'm throwing it out there this week. We've got a pretty big following, and since our hiatus, since we've been back, that following has really come back and grown, and a lot of you folks, there's a lot of awesome listeners out there. So there's a pretty big audience for anyone out there who has a Japan-related business who would like to advertise with us over here at the Just Japan Podcast. So if you'd like to do that, please write me an email at justjapanpodcast@gmail.com. You can contact me on Twitter at madformaple. Go over to the Facebook page, facebook.com/justjapanstuff, and get a hold of me, and I'd be happy to talk to you. And we can put something together. That would be really great. Because again, this podcast, which I'm sending out to your ears each and every week, I think it has a lot to offer. And I think we have a lot to offer different Japan businesses out there who would like to do a little bit of advertising. All right, so moving on from there. Guys, next week we got a huge thing going on. Episode 200. And the episode is already recorded. It was awesome. It was fun. It was a party with some of the most returning guests that you guys know in the Just Japan podcast-averse. They're here. There were 5 of us sitting down, hanging out, talking about a lot of Japan things, a lot of Just Japan podcast history, trivia, all that stuff, and it was a lot of fun, and you guys are gonna love it. So episode number 200 is coming next weekend. It's gonna be so cool. I want to thank all of you awesome people out there for taking the time to download this podcast. Please share the heck out of it on your social media, help us grow, and all that stuff. And yeah, that's it, guys. My name's Kevin. I'm coming to you from Beijing, China at the moment. I lived in Japan for a gajillion years. I'll be there in just a few weeks from now. I can't wait. Going to be visiting Japan in June for a few weeks. It's going to be awesome. You guys are awesome too. So, wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. And I'll be talking to you again next week.